So thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people here to hear a little bit about bees. Wait, I need my clicker for when the moment comes. This is the first time I've given this talk since before COVID, so I have my cheat sheet up here in case I get stuck somewhere along the way. But I'll just get going. So I was not a writer. And your life has these moments where things change sometimes, and sometimes you recognize those moments when they happen, and sometimes it's only when you look back and you go, oh, wait a minute, that was a moment. I hadn't recognized it. So when my kids were little, I went and studied horticulture and garden design and started a little garden design and coaching business. And one day I was standing around a soccer field waiting for my daughter, as parents do, and I ran into one of my old horticulture instructors, and she said, asked me what I was doing, and I said I was teaching some continuing ed classes on gardening and pruning and really having a good time with the teaching. And she said, well, teaching can be done with writing too. And I'm pretty sure she was hawking a class that they were having at that time, but it put an idea in my head. So I started sending out a newsletter for the garden design business. And I started a gardening blog, and I got a couple of little gardening articles written, and this was all over the space of years. And I was looking for a new idea, and I ran across this nonprofit in Seattle, where I was living, that was looking to find out if there were enough native bees to pollinate people's edible gardens sufficiently. And because they were interested in native bees, they needed to exclude honeybees because honeybees aren't native to North America. They came over with the early colonists from Europe. And so how they were going to achieve this was by looking at tomato pollination, because honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes. Now this was a moment. This was a big moment, because it's like, what are you kidding me? Honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes? How did I not know this? I have been a gardener for decades. I felt like a dope. But then I started asking around, and hardly anybody else knew either. And I don't know whether it was, sort of the age I was at the time, it was sort of a midlife crisis or what, but I was filled with this kind of zeal. Here's the honeybee can't pollinate tomatoes. The people should know. And so the reason why honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes is because they are one of a group of plants that needs a special kind of pollination called buzz pollination. And so while most flowers have their pollen like on the outside of the anthers where anybody can just come by and help themselves or rub up against it, there's a whole group of plants that have what are called poricidal anthers. They've got little holes, and the pollen is inside. And so it has to be shaken out like salt from a salt shaker, and honeybees don't know how to do it. So one of the bees that's really good at this is bumblebees. And what they'll do is they come up to a flower and they grab it with their mouth parts. And then they shiver certain specific muscles that causes a buzzing or shaking, and they shake the pollen out of the flower. So here, I've got a little video for you.
The following is a production of the University of Minnesota.
The music is very important. In just a second, they're going to switch to a tuning fork so you can really sort of see what happens. This is not a tomato, but it's also one that needs clearly buzz pollination.
Amazing.
Yeah. So this was, again, this was a moment. So I went and decided I'm going to learn about some of these other bees, and I fell in love. There are 20,000 species of bees in the world, and about 4,000 in the US and Canada. And so I started reading and learning, but a lot of the bee facts, when I'd go out and try and identify some of these bees, out in the yard, couldn't do it. So I looked for a class. Couldn't find one in Seattle, but it's the internet. I found one in California. So I called them up. I said, if I come learn about your bees, will that help me with knowing my bees? And they said, yes. So I went. Now, at this point, it was 2014, I think, I had 2 teenage kids. So the idea of sleeping on a screened-in porch with strangers and wandering around after bees for 4 days was a really good vacation. I learned a lot, and even more importantly, from those moments in the book point of view, I met a man, Robin Thorpe. He was the premier bumblebee entomologist in the country, and he was a man with many t-shirts with bees on it. I never saw him wear anything but t-shirts with bees on them. And he was one of the instructors there, and if you look at his left hand, you see he's got something like a strange plastic gun. It's a kid's like insect vacuum. So when he would go out to hunt bees, he would have a bee net and a voice recorder and his insect vacuum. And when I was there for that class, he told a story about a bee called Franklin's bumblebee. There are 46 species of bumblebees in the US and Canada. And they have ranges. They don't just, everybody lives everywhere. There's East Coast bees and West Coast bees and northern bees. And Franklin's bumblebee has the smallest range of any bumblebee in North America and maybe the world. It's about 200 miles long and 70 miles wide, and it's centered around Ashland, Oregon, down there near the California border. So back in the 1990s, the US Forest Service asked Robin to do a survey to see how well Franklin's bumblebees were doing. And his theory on why they asked him is because this was when the spotted owl had gone on the endangered species list, and he thought that maybe the Forest Service thought that if there was another endangered species in the area because their ranges overlapped, it might take some of the heat off. Regardless of the reason, Robin went out in 1998 to look for bees. Now, bee hunting is moseying. You mosey from one group of flowers to the next group of flowers. If you find some bees, you swing your bee net or you use your little bug vacuum and you collect them up. If you're Robin, you take a look at them for a second and go, Bombus bifarius, into your recorder and let it go, and then you're done. If you're the rest of us, you look at it for a while and maybe you pull out a book, and then you think, and eventually you might go ask Robin what it is, and if you're lucky, he'll tell you, and if you're not, he'll start asking you questions. So that first year, 1998, he found 94 specimens of Franklin's bumblebee, which was about middle of the pack for the species there. There were probably about 10 or so. The next year he went again. There were 20, but he thought nothing about it because bee species tend to go, or bee numbers tend to go up and down a lot from year to year. The next year there were 9. The following year there was 1. Popped back up to 20, but then it was back down to single digits. Something was wrong. And Robin had a theory on what that was, and it has to do with the fact that honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes. So greenhouse tomatoes are a really lucrative object for people, but the problem is they're in the greenhouse. How do you get them pollinated? There's no wind, there's no insects, so they would have shake tables or they'd be hand pollinated. But in the 1980s, some people in Europe figured out how to wake bumblebees up in the wintertime. I mean, and they're usually sort of hibernating, so getting them to wake up, get out there and pollinate and start making babies was not a straightforward thing to learn how to do, but somebody did. And so, of course, the greenhouse tomato keepers here were like, well, we want some of those bees, but you couldn't import them, it wasn't allowed. But what was allowed was they sent some of their bees, our bees, North American bees, to Europe to get the special wake-up treatment, and then they got sent back. And Robin's theory is when they came back, they brought a disease that spread into the wild. Because it wasn't just Franklin's bumblebee that saw declines, it was some of its close relatives as well. The last known Franklin's bumblebee was seen in 2006 on the slopes of Mount Ashland. Robin found it. But he kept going every year until probably about 2018. He died in 2019, and Franklin's bumblebee was added to the endangered species list in 2021. There it is. Franklin's bumblebee. So when I heard this story, it was another moment because it was like, this is the way to get people interested in these bees, is to tell stories about them, not just that this one has this many stripes of this color, but how they live and what they do. So most of the rest of this talk is going to be more stories about some of the bees that I've learned about. But before we go there, we need to figure out what a bee is. Because for a lot of us, a bee equals honeybee. Or it might just be anything with a stripy bottom that stings. And both would be wrong. Because if you do the stripy bottom that stings, that includes a lot of wasps, and it actually leaves out a lot of bees because there are no male bees that sting, because a stinger is modified from a female's reproductive parts. So clearly the guys don't have one. And there's even some female bees that don't sting, or they have such puny little stingers that it's hardly worth noting. So if you leave the stripy bottoms and the stingers aside, what makes a bee a bee? Well, it's got 3 body parts because it's an insect. A head, a middle section called the thorax, and a back end called the abdomen. There are 6 legs attached to the middle section along with 4 wings, and it has 2 antennae. It is closely related to wasps, but wasps, mothers catch and subdue prey to feed to their baby. Their baby wasps are carnivores, whereas baby bees eat pollen and nectar, and have long been said to be vegetarian. But you know, there was that article that I wrote for Scientific American that bees need meat. Well, it turns out in the pollen that they collect, there is, not surprisingly, bacteria and fungus. And it's like, well, yeah, of course. But it turns out that they need that bacteria and fungus as well as the pollen, because if you remove it, the baby bees fail to thrive. Some die, some are just small. They need that fungus as well. And so it is because the fungus and the bacteria are eating the pollen, they're sort of like herbivores, which would make bees omnivores. So nevertheless, bee mothers go out and collect pollen for the babies, and they're well equipped for that. They tend to be hairier than wasps. All of them aren't. But the hairs that they have are branched, which is helpful for holding on to pollen. And female bees generally have somewhere on their body to store that pollen so they can transport it home. So if you look at the hind legs, you'll see that of the Melisodes up there, that it's incredibly hairy. And when you look down here at the Diadacia, you see what they use it for. She has loaded so much pollen onto the hairs on her hind legs that it looks like she's had to move her middle leg out of the way to make room for it. So many bees carry their pollen and hairs on their hind legs, although a lot of times it's not so abundant as this. Honeybees and bumblebees do it differently. They've got flat spots, and they will wet their pollen down with nectar and make these tiny little bundles. There's another whole group that doesn't carry them on their legs at all, but carries it in hairs on the underside of their abdomens. Nevertheless, if you see an insect on a plant and it looks like it's carrying pollen in some deliberate way, rather than, well, it just sort of rolled in it, you're almost certainly looking at a female bee. Male bees don't do this because they have nothing to do with childcare. Male bees are just about the sex. There's about 200,000 different species of pollinating animals out there. And among them, the female bees tend to be the premier pollinators because of that pollen collection. Because a lot of the others, they're just there to get nectar. And they may rub against the pollen or they may not, but because female bees deliberately go to get pollen, that's the first step of pollination. And they're incredibly variable. Some are really tiny. And here is the smallest bee in the US. It's called Perdita minima, on the head of the biggest bee, which is a large carpenter bee. Some bees are really fuzzy. Some have almost no hair at all. Some are really quite gloriously colored, and some are sort of dowdy. So there's a lot of variability in bees out there, and a lot of them don't look like honeybees. But because, even though this is on native bees, I mean, how can we not talk about honeybees? They've been here a long time, we all know them, we're all familiar with them, they give us honey, and they're the only bee that does that in North America. And so, let's talk a little bit about honeybees. They are sort of an odd duck of a bee, because they're highly social, which means that you have multiple generations living together and working together. And so in a honeybee colony, you've got one queen, and then a whole batch of her daughters who do a lot of other work. The queen lays eggs. If things are going well, she can apparently lay up to 1,000 eggs a day. Meanwhile, her daughters are doing queen care, or looking after the kids, or going out to get food, or taking out the trash, doing various jobs. So when she lays an egg, assuming it's a worker bee, a female worker bee that she lays, as opposed to a male or a queen to be, about 3 weeks later, there'll be a whole batch of new adult bees, and they'll start working. Usually around 6 weeks after that, that batch of bees will be dead, and a whole new batch will come and start working. And that's sort of how the season goes until you get to fall, when there's a batch of bees that are laid that can live long enough to survive the winter. And that's part of what makes honeybees really unusual, is that their colonies are perennial. They're smaller in the winter, but there's actually a colony that lasts through the whole winter. And there's no other bees like that in North America. There are other social bees. Bumblebees are social, but their colonies only last a season. So you'll have a queen, and she will emerge from her winter sleep. She'll find a nice hole that can hold a couple of dozen to a couple of hundred bees, and then she will lay eggs and make her colony. And once the first batch of her eggs have reached adulthood, the daughters go out and do the collecting, and then mom just stays home and lays more eggs. At the end of the season is when she will lay eggs that are going to be male and new queens. And so they all sort of leave the nest, they mate, and then everybody dies but the young queens to be who have mated, and they will go find themselves a little hole where they can sort of sleep through the winter. And there's a lot that can go wrong for that bee before she gets a chance to sort of have her own offspring the next year. Her little hole could get washed out in the rains. She could get eaten in the winter time. She's living on her fat stores, so if winter goes on for too long, she may not survive because she doesn't have enough fat storage. If she comes out and there's not food around, she could run into trouble. When they look for a hole, they usually look for holes in the ground, and they really like old rodent holes. She might not find a hole, or she might find a hole and another bumblebee queen finds a hole, and then they have a fight and one or both of them may die. And then she lays her eggs, the eggs hatch, and she's got a bunch of hungry larvae to feed all by herself until they reach adulthood. So you figure that's a pretty stressful month or so when that new queen comes out of her winter's hibernation. There are other social bees in North America, but these are two of the best known. And again, social bees are unusual. Most bees don't live that way, and that means most bees don't have those childcare issues either. Most bees are solitary. And so what that means is that the female bee will find a hole. It can be below ground or above ground, depending on the kind of bee. And she will go out and collect pollen and nectar, enough that she feels like, okay, here's enough. And then she'll put that in the hole, she'll lay an egg on it, and she'll move on. She never sees that bee grow up. She doesn't mess with it or do anything with it. She just goes ahead and starts making a new pollen wad for a new egg. And her whole time sort of out as an adult flying in the sun usually is 6 weeks. So most of a bee's life is in the dark, from the time that they're laid as an egg until they emerge as adults for their short periods. This alkali bee is from out, well, I don't know where that one was, but there's lots of them out near Walla Walla where the alfalfa fields are. And some of the growers out there have made special beds for these ground nesting bees because they're very particular about the kind of ground they'll use. It has to have the right moisture levels and the right amount of salt, but they are wonderful pollinators of alfalfa. And they're what are called gregarious nesters. Each one has its own hole and does all of its own food collection, but they're clearly happy to be right next to each other. And here is, somebody had dug up some of those. They were doing some research, and on your left you can see bee bedrooms. The bees are just baby bees at this point, so they're tiny young larvae on their pollen wads. And on the right you can see one that's a little bit older and a little bit further along. So they will stay in those, or they would have if they hadn't been dug up. And those holes, this was May or June. And all of the others will stay in those holes until April or May of next year. They'll just go into a hibernation state, and they won't have any more food. This is all the food they get to last them for that nearly a year and to grow them to adulthood. Now, females are solitary, but the guys don't necessarily do it the way the females do. Melisode females are solitary, but the guys, when it comes time to go to bed, often will congregate and sleep together on a stem. I've seen this on occasion in Seattle, and these are what are called longhorn bees because you can see how long their antennae are. And the males have longer antennae than the females for this particular species. So there's social bees and there's solitary bees, and it's probably no surprise that there's also bees whose lifestyle falls somewhere in between. And this is one of them, Ceratina calcarata. It's an East Coast bee. And how this bee works, it's a small carpenter bee, and she makes nests in pithy stems like an elderberry. And she'll go in there and she'll sort of chew out the interior of the stem. So she's got like a nice long hallway. She collects pollen and nectar, she puts her little wad in there, she lays her egg on it, and then next to it, she'll do the same thing. So there'll be this little row getting sort of younger and younger. But she lives in that stem with them. And she doesn't die in 6 weeks. She lives longer. And she'll go in and sort of check on the kids. Have any parasites gotten in? Let me remove those parasites. And she's still alive when her offspring reach adulthood. But then they need food. And if they go out to get it themselves, the sort of wear and tear of the hunting would mean that they wouldn't make it through the winter. So she goes and does it, but she doesn't do it by herself. The very first pollen wad that she had gotten was smaller than all the rest because how much food those larvae eat means how big they're going to be as a bee. So it's going to be a small bee. And a bee can also choose, is it going to be female or male? And the first one is always female. And so that first little pollen wad and the bee that comes from it is called the dwarf eldest daughter. Mom makes dwarf eldest daughter go out with her to get food for her brothers and sisters. But because she's small and because she's doing this work, she's not going to survive the winter. And so she has been given the nickname of Cinderella. Another solitary bee that some of you may know are the orchard mason bee, blue orchard bee, bob, Osmia lignaria. It's a bee that goes by many names. I bought some cocoons, 20 years or so ago, and hoped that they would help my apple trees produce better, and they did not. Nor did they fill the little holes. They nest in above ground holes that you can put out for them where they find their own. And one of the keys, and I think the problem with mine, is these are called mason bees for a reason, because Mom goes out, she collects pollen and nectar, she lays an egg on it, but then she builds a wall out of mud between them. And so if your soil is super sandy, which my soil was, it wouldn't make a mud wall. So she probably went off someplace where there was mud to be had, rather than staying around my house. So these are masons. I titled this Masons, Miners, and Thieves. So The alkali bee that burrows into the ground would be one of the miners. There's many of them. This would be masons. You can see on the right that there's holes of different sizes. There's lots of different bees that will nest in above ground holes, and depending on the size of the bee, some like big holes and some like little holes. Now, orchard mason bees are primo pollinators of early fruit. And a couple of hundred female blue orchard bees can pollinate an acre of fruit trees as well as a colony of honeybees that will have thousands of bees probably in it. And the reason for that is they have different ways of doing things. The blue orchard bee will fly when it's colder. They tend to fly for more hours during the day. The blue orchard bee female always is collecting both pollen and nectar at the same time from a plant, whereas honeybees may be collecting pollen or nectar, so the ones collecting just nectar may not do any pollination. They carry their, let's go back, you can see in the photo on the right, this is one of the group that carries pollen dry on the underside of their abdomen. And so, it sort of rubs off pretty easily. And somebody who works with them a lot told me it's like, and they sort of belly flop into flowers. So you can see why they might spread the pollen around a little better than a more fastidious honeybee might. And then, one of my favorites, this is a bee from, I think, Texas or New Mexico. Is this Diadacia innovata that is both a mason and a miner. So it digs down into the ground. It starts its drilling by sort of putting its head on the ground and rotating in circles. So it makes it go ahead, and it's a miner, and then it'll build these little chimneys. And in the mornings, it will bring its bee poop up to the surface and put it on the top of its chimneys. So it's very thrifty, using its poop to make its little chimney taller. And then there are the thieves, and the thieves fall into a couple of groups. There's opportunistic thieves. This is an opportunistic thief. So bees have mouth parts that vary a lot, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this bee did not have a mouth that it could sort of go to the end of the flower, stick its mouth parts up the flower, and get to the juicy goodness up there. And it's clearly too big to crawl up the flower. So it made a little hole. And occasionally you can look at flowers and you can see little holes near where the nectar is, where somebody has done some thievery. And so clearly they're not going to be doing any pollination. So this is an opportunistic thief. And since I'm talking about mouth parts, I'm just going to show you. There's short-tongued bees and long-tongued bees. This is a short-tongued bee. And it's called a cellophane bee because it secretes this cellophane-like substance. It's a ground nester. And then it coats the walls of its baby bees' bedrooms with this cellophane. And when you look to the right, you can see why, because the pollen and nectar it collects is much more liquidy. And so something needs to contain it. And there's actually little hairs on its tongue, just like a paintbrush that it uses. So that's a short-tongued bee. And here's a long-tongued bee. So this bee is from the Atacama Desert in Chile, which is supposed to be the driest desert in the world. And so the flowers that are there keep their nectar really deep to prevent evaporation. So you need really long mouth parts. And what it can do, as you can see, it looks like there's two parts at the end. It can put them together so that it forms a straw. And then it can suck the nectar up out of that. Now, when I saw this picture, my thought was, how can it fly with that hanging off the front of its head? It can fold them. It can fold it away. So that's an exceedingly long-tongued bee. Most of them are not that long. The more conventional thieves are called kleptoparasites, and here is a group of mothers that don't collect pollen and nectar for their offspring. Instead, they arrange for their children to steal it. So the little bee up on the left is a kleptoparasite. And each kleptoparasite has a specific bee that is like its chosen host where it's going to do its thievery. And so that one was waiting while another bee had sort of dug its nest in the ground and was waiting for that other bee to leave to go get pollen and nectar for the host bee's baby. Then she'll nip down into that hole and lay her egg in there. And I asked this guy who had been studying these kinds of bees for 60 years, and it's like, well, how come the host bee mom doesn't like notice and get rid of the egg? And it's like, well, you know, she usually like sticks it into the wall of the chamber. And then he looked at me and he said, and it's dark in there, and she doesn't have a flashlight. And so what'll happen is that usually the kleptoparasite egg will hatch sooner than the host one will. So it's a larva while the other one's still an egg. So it's ready. And when the other one comes out, it will kill it. And they are usually, the kleptoparasite larvae often have these big mouth parts, which are good for dispatching the other larvae. So, kleptoparasites. I hunted for some of the bees from this area and found a list or two, not necessarily for the Methow, but for north central Washington. And there were quite a few bumblebees in the area, but the one that was found most often in this study is one called Bombus bifarius. Up on the upper right, the Hylaeus, you can see it's like they've sort of glued it to a pin, so that silver thing going by it is like the shaft of a pin, so it's a really teeny weeny bee. And then you've got a different osmia, so the blue orchard bee, the orchard mason bee is an osmia. This is related to them as well, and so it's going to collect pollen on the underside of its abdomen. Then there's the dianthidium, which I liked because of its nice orange legs. And then, very cool, the Agapostman femoratus. And if you look at its hind legs, like these big, weird, ball-shaped hind legs, I don't know why that is. But certainly it explains why it got its name. So green bees are, most places have a couple of species of green bees around. So what can you do to help some of these native bees? Be really thoughtful when you use pesticides of any sort. So a pesticide is like, if it's an insecticide, it goes after insects. A miticide goes after spiders and mites. Rodenticide goes after rodents. And so they are tested to see if they're bee safe, but I was a little surprised when I learned what that testing entails, which historically has meant that they look to see if the pesticide is harmful to adult worker honeybees. They don't look at the larvae, they don't look at the males, they don't look at the queens, they don't look at other species of bees, and I understand because there's a money issue with that. But given how diverse bees are, you can't be sure that if it's bee safe, it's going to be safe for all bees, or that it's going to be safe perhaps particularly for larvae. And I believe this is starting to change, that they're starting to expand that, which is great. But if you think about like a butterfly where the larvae, the caterpillars eat leaves and the adults do nectar, the larvae and the adults can have very different needs. So again, it's just to be mindful when you are choosing to use whatever you use. Okay, this is Seattle. Clearly you guys don't have these gardens. But I left it in here to show my point of where you can find some variety, both at the same time but even more so over the season, so that hopefully there's stuff available at different times of the year or for whatever bees might be available then. And to think about, okay, do I have any shrubs that I can use that are get taller than where the deer can browse? But they also supply a lot of flowers in one go. So you can think about different heights as well. So at the end of this, I was going to ask if there's anybody who knows some really good plants that they've seen that are good for bees out here, because I have not been out here enough to know them yet. The other thing to think about is you can be easygoing with lawn if you want, because some of the common lawn weeds can actually be really good for bees. So again, these studies weren't done here, but you can see that clover in 2 different places hosted an array of species of bees, and even dandelions had 20 species of bees and 25 species altogether. And so if you have a lawn with clover in it, and it's like, well, but I'm gonna have a party, and I don't wanna get stung by the bees, then you can mow it before the party. So again, it's something to consider, and I like not having to worry about trying to keep the clover out of the lawn. 70% of bees nest in the ground, and so it's good to have some areas that are undisturbed, especially if you happen to see that there are bees there, to leave it undisturbed so that the bees can continue to be there, and that you don't plant that area or till or mulch unless you gotta. Oh, here's some more green bees. I like the green bees. And then the other 30% nest in above ground holes, and a lot of them are willing to nest in holes provided for them, as well as just sort of holes that are already out there. And different sized holes will pull in different sized bees. And there are a number of bees that will nest in, again, those pithy stems, and I like elderberry. And so when I'm cleaning up, if I've got stems like that, I may just like set them off in the corner so that if there are any bees in there, I can wait till next spring or next summer. Whatever bees are in there will have emerged, and then I can deal with the stems at that point, rather than dealing with them right when I cut them down when the bees might still be in there. And I'm going to end with the artist bee. This bee, I don't remember its name, is from Turkey. And it's sort of amazing how it makes this. So this is a ground nesting bee, makes little shallow holes in the ground. And the bee will go and will cut one of these flower petals and will bring the petal back to its little nest cell, 1 petal piece at a time, until it gets enough to fill the hole. And then it will create this cell and use nectar as glue to hold the little pieces together. And once it gets the petals done, it goes off and it gets mud. And it slathers mud on the inside of those petals. And then it goes and gets more petals and puts more petals, another layer of petals on the inside of the mud. And then it goes and gets pollen and nectar and lays its egg. And then it will fold down the inner petals, slather on a little mud, fold down the outer petals, and apply some nectar so those will stay down. It will float if it gets washed out because it's almost airtight. If it gets really dry where it is, the mud and the petals keep the larva from desiccating. And once the mud actually dries, it's pretty hard. And so if something with hooves, say, comes along and steps on it, it's less likely to be squashed. And to me, this is sort of the marvel of bees. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much.